Hi, welcome to the Political Forum podcast. This is our premiere episode. And if you're a member of the Political Forum, you'll notice that tonight's episode is a little different in terms of the formats. Usually we gather in large groups and we have open discussions on a whole host of issues. And I really enjoy that because I learn a lot from different members. And especially when various members come, I gain fresh perspectives from attendance of other members. Along the way, I did observe that it's very difficult to have an intimate, in-depth conversation because political topics by their nature are very divisive, and we tend to talk over each other instead of listening to each other and engaging in a real meaningful conversation. And I think now more so than ever, it's very imperative that all of us engage in a deep conversation to listen to each other and share each other's perspective. So before we continue, I just want to introduce you to our team. Co-hosting with me tonight is my friend, John Kerbau. Hello, John.
Hello.
And I've known John for many years. He's got a very impressive resume, and one of these episodes, we're going to talk about the book that he's currently working on. So look forward to that. And also on our team is Annat. Hello, Annat. And Annat is joining us from sunny California. And our very first guest is my friend and a member of the Political Forum, Erik Carter. Hey guys.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So today is January 7th, 2021. We're 1 week into this new year. And given all the things that have been going on, it seems like this year so far has been an eternity. And is that a sign of things to come for this year? What do you guys think?
Yeah, 2021 was supposed to be the year that everything turns around. And right now it seems like things are turning not in the direction that people are hoping for. So hopefully it'll turn around again.
I feel like 2021 is like the DEA or SWAT team breaking into your trailer when you just lit up a joint and you're trying to relax. That's almost what happened in the last 6 days or so, but hopefully it's just a little bump in the road.
But it seems like we tend to engage in these artificial time periods where you think with the flick of a switch, when a new year is ushered in, that things will just go back to normal, but we're certainly far from that, aren't we?
Yeah. I feel like it's like a big mental health pause where people can sort of collectively, even if it's only symbolic, it's a way for people to sort of self-organize and find meaningful common ways to relate to each other and relate to ideas of hope and fresh starts and things like that. So I think it has its merits, but yeah, the last couple of days has been quite the, almost like something out of a really bad B movie,
Yeah, and another thing I noticed during the time of pandemic is it's really hard to keep track of like what month of the year that we're in, because everything is just like a big blur. I mean, I know that it's cold outside. We're coming from New York, so we're in the midst of a winter. So we know that the weather is cold, but other than that, we just don't have any, any points of reference that we could have in terms of the things that we normally do, like going on vacations, attending other special events that are based on seasonal factors. So, but now that we're in a middle of a pandemic, I mean, the year ended somewhat on a positive note with the vaccine rollout. So what do you guys think? Would you take a vaccine, John?
I would. I mean, so that's a short answer. It's, you know me, I'm an advocate of skepticism in science and looking at data. I think science works because it's a lot of people checking each other's ideas through multiple peer reviews. If someone's wrong, they'll be called out on it. So it's a system that is very self-correcting by nature. And there is a process of vetting new pharmaceutical, products. And if Americans are comfortable with, Pfizer coming out with everything under the sun for their erectile dysfunction, and they don't even bat an eye at these god-awful pharmaceutical commercials that come on during dinner, and yet everyone's freaking out about a vaccine. I think we need to separate healthy skepticism from conspiracy theories and ideologically driven paranoia. So yes, we should always be skeptical. We should always look at the data. Has this been properly tested? Have there been clinical trials? Do your due diligence, make sure it's safe. If it's safe, absolutely take it. That's just me. I know some people still are going to be resistant, but short answer, if it passes muster with that skeptical test, then yeah, absolutely. I don't have any conspiracies, but I respect their people that do, and we need to learn how to better talk to those people, you know? So that's my short, long answer, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think sometimes people forget that when we are skeptical, we also have to be skeptical of the counter narrative, right? As well as the dominant narrative. And oftentimes you see with conspiracy theories, people are skeptical of that, of quote, the mainstream opinion, but you know, they don't necessarily apply that same skepticism to kind of these alternative explanations of things. And I think the same thing is true of the vaccine. People are worried about risks, but there's, of course, you know, there's been a whole testing period, as John pointed out, but we also know for sure that the risks are high of not taking the vaccine, right? And so you have to weigh that risk as well.
Yeah. Like, I'm not personally too worried about the virus. I don't want to pass it on to somebody else. And it's weird. We've been at this for like well over half a year. People still, just looking at countless people on social media and other people, seem to not understand this is about not passing it on and the vector or the way it spreads like a Christmas tree to other people. So it's like, if I could just get the virus and get it over with, I'd be whatever, but it'll pass on, and the third, fourth, fifth person down the line could die or be affected. And there's a ripple effect of human suffering. So that should incentivize people to stay diligent, if anything. That's what's so perverse about this virus, is the way it forces us to all be interconnected when it comes to watching each other's back. It reminds me of a really annoying version of like being on a military fire team where everybody's got to worry about the next person. And if you die, it affects the team. Or it's like if you pass along the virus, even if you're okay, you're screwing your buddy. And people in the military understand this, or veterans understand this. I think people who played football or other team sports kind of intuitively get this. There are a lot of people that don't, and they're just like, you know, completely nihilistic about it or something. And it's, you know, it's I don't know. I think this really forced me to think about how best to communicate effectively with other Americans about, you know, because really the gateway to the mind is through the heart. And a lot of people are just so closed off to mainstream media, mainstream narratives, that if you're going to convince them to take protective measures, you got to appeal to their moral psychology. So for a lot of conservatives, it's, you know, they see the mask as a sign of like liberal nanny state taking away their freedom, and it becomes a moral symbol. One way I think is effective is to say a mask is a sign of respect. Do it because you want to do it. No one's making you. You can't be forced to do it. I realize you don't have to do it, but it's a sign of respect to your neighbor. That resonates with a lot of Americans, conservatives in particular, and I think that's good. So it's just an example of how I think we can tweak our communication and really, I don't know, try to keep some sensible discussion going about this with other people. I don't know. It's hard to. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, not much to argue with there.
One point, I think the messaging has not been very good. And I think this kind of shows the tragedy that's certainly preventable. So again, through the marvels of, you know, modern technology and, you know, pharmacology, we were able to come up with the genomic map of the virus in a matter of weeks and just a matter of months. I mean, it's a record-breaking, you know, accomplishment for us to come up with multiple vaccines that's been clinically tested. Granted, you know, it's only given out on, you know, limited basis, but still had this accomplishment in a record number of months, yet we are failing on the messaging, public confidence, and distribution. So I think that shows that no matter how good our technologies are, we also need some system in place so that we could, you know, effectively communicate to the public, because it is a public health after all, isn't it? So
Yeah. I think this is really weird because a lot of people will have different, and we've done some interesting psychology studies on this. A lot of people have very fundamentally different emotional, sort of visceral reactions to tangible threats that have agency, like bad people coming to kill them, the perception of terrorism and other external threats that have agency, that have directionality, that have intention to them. People tend to react more to that, at least a lot of conservatives do, than to something like that seems more abstract without intention, like a virus. A virus is much more abstract. It doesn't fit into our preconceived narratives of an enemy, a conventional enemy. So a lot of people have a harder time emotionally processing that and don't see it, don't treat the risk the way they treat the risk on, say, a gun range. So it's really weird. A lot of the people I've served with in the military or that are veterans that, been in for a long time, if you go to a gun range and you, for even a second, don't have your weapon on safe at the right time, you don't have muzzle awareness, you're doing something unsafe, they will immediately flip a switch and talk about how you're a safety hazard, the importance of safety on the range. But then you talk about wearing a mask and they almost become some people become completely indifferent, seemingly indifferent and very risk tolerant to not wearing a mask, even though the risk to other human lives is far greater than having your weapon, on fire for a couple seconds when it should be unsafe. These are both dangerous, but they seem to have a big double standard in how they react to dangerous situations. So it's like the brain processes the danger differently. So people assess risk in fundamentally different ways. And some of the people that are biggest on safety when it comes to, safety at the job site, safety on the gun range, or safety when you're out on patrol in a war zone, seem the opposite when it comes to safety with the pandemic. And then a lot of your liberals and your so-called, hippies are the ones that are the most safe or the most risk averse when it comes to the pandemic. So this reversal, I don't know, it's been a really interesting experiment in like moral psychology. I think this is almost something we're not even used to, like how we process viruses. It's. But.
Well, I guess I could speak a little bit further to that point, is that given the individualistic nature of Americans, they don't like to be told what to do. And I think when they're told to do one thing or another, they automatically resort to their ideological corners, and they take huge offense to the fact that they're required to be quarantined, wear a mask, or get vaccinated. So I think that's just inherently kind of the rugged individualism of Americans. But yeah, I think the perception of risk is certainly interesting because when you ask people, why do you have for instance, people who are pro-Second Amendment, why do you have so many guns? Well, because I need to protect myself. So they do understand that there's some degree of protection or safety they need to maintain, but on other aspects of risk assessment, they don't take it more, I guess, they don't heed the warning in some sense. And I think that the left does it also because sometimes those who are very critical of vaccines tend to come from the left, the anti-vaccine people. So
Right.
It's an interesting paradox. So now, Erik, let me ask you, it seems like we're having a very difficult time with the distribution and the administering of the vaccine. So do you think that's kind of a critique of our health care system? What do you think?
One thing that I noticed about this whole discussion about the vaccine rollout is everyone seems completely fine with the idea that we're essentially rationing the vaccine, right? It's a question of how do we ration it? Do the frontline workers get prioritized over the elderly and people with underlying conditions? And it's interesting because that was always one of the biggest critiques of going to something like a single payer, where people were afraid of the idea of the government rationing healthcare. And here we essentially are rationing something that is going to determine lives. And I don't hear anyone saying, well, we should put the vaccine up for bid, and whoever can pay the most gets it first, which in extent would be the completely 100% free market approach. So that kind of thing. So even before we get into the actual rollout, just it's strangely, it is something that I think is widely accepted, is the idea that it should be rationed based on need. And which begs to mind the question of, well, if we're going to ration the vaccine by need, why not ration other medical services by need too? In terms of why the rollout is slow, I think a lot of that has to do, we don't have a centralized system. You know, every state is doing things differently. There's not a lot of coordination, which also maybe that's a problem with our healthcare system as well.
So do you think if we had a robust, let's say like a single payer system, the rollout would have been more efficient?
I think it potentially could have been, simply because you would already have systems in place that kind of manage the entire system. And even before the vaccines, when you're trying to figure out, well, who gets ventilators and hospital beds and shifting nurses, I mean, there was the need for some sort of planning, you know, around the system, and we kind of had to create all that ad hoc.
Yeah, but the other argument that I hear, and I'm not sure how accurate this is, but if there is a single payer system, there's less incentive for the pharmaceutical companies to engage in R&D. So perhaps the development and manufacturing of the vaccine would not have been as robust. And because it's private industry with competition, that's what kind of fueled, you know, mass production within record number of months. What do you think about that?
Well, maybe this is something John knows more about than I do, but I almost wouldn't want to say the opposite, right? Because, I mean, I don't know to what extent the government was involved in the vaccine, but I think it was pretty involved. And I think there's also some type of price control, because I think the whole issue, it's not even really about a single payer system. It's about the prices that drug companies would get. And so the idea is that if you have price controls, which single payer systems do, they're not going to make as much profit, so there's less of incentive to innovate. And I don't know if either of you know more about what that process was like for the vaccine, but it certainly wasn't the case that these companies can develop the vaccine and charge as much as they wanted for it and make as much money as they could, because, I mean, I do think there were some price controls in place.
Right. Well, I'm definitely not an expert in healthcare or in the delivery mechanisms for, you know, development of the vaccine or how it's distributed. But broadly speaking, I think it's good to build a bridge of understanding with a lot of Americans. When people talk about single payer, usually they're not talking about the micromanagement of individual healthcare. A lot of people have been reflexively conditioned to associate single payer with the buzzwords like socialism or government-run healthcare or taken away choice. Single payer, and tell me if I'm wrong, it simply, generally speaking, refers to simplifying and streamlining how it's paid for. And there's many countries like France and Norway and others have, you know, kind of hybrid systems where there is choice, there is some degree of free market, but they also eliminate a lot of the ridiculously perverse incentives and complexity in the red tape that we have in whatever cluster of the hybrid system we have here, where here there's just this perverse wedding of like this perverse marriage between, you know, profit-driven incentive, which could be good or bad depending on what you're talking about. But that's sort of mired. It's like there's a weird relationship between private insurance companies and government, you know, and special interest in government, the way government pays for it. So our system is prohibitively costly, both to taxpayers and to recipients of healthcare. And the whole thing is just, it's not a free market system. It's not socialism. It's like a weird bastardized sort of hybrid. But there's also good hybrids where you can preserve freedom of choice, but you can cut out a lot of the red tape. So I think the overarching idea when people talk about single payer, it's, you know, can we streamline this and simplify how it's paid for? And there's arguments that single payer can cut cost, that this will allow you to have better access to healthcare when you need it, have more money in your pocket without paying all this ridiculous cost, and have ultimately more upward mobility and economic freedom. I think the average American doesn't have enough money, like is one step away from total financial ruin with a big legal bill or a medical bill, like barely has like what, $600 in the bank. So in terms of economic freedom metrics, there's a lot about this as well when it comes to rethinking how conservatives and liberals could agree on what we really value and what we really want. Like you can preserve freedom and talk about cost control and red tape and bureaucracy. And that's where people are trying to steer this single payer conversation. I don't know how that ties into the vaccine, but yeah, if you guys have any thoughts on that, I was hoping that could provide some. That's just sort of the way I look at this, is getting people to think in these terms. Like, can we really get people to sit down together, have a beer, and talk about what single payer really means, because media narratives have like driven people into these reflexive camps of like socialism versus free market, and it's kind of a false choice. There's a range of healthcare systems that can appeal, I think, to conservatives and liberals both, that are far better than the dumpster fire that we have currently.
Yeah, I think one particular proposal that I've heard about that I think is a good hybrid of single payer and a more free market approach would be this idea of a universal catastrophic single payer plan. And so the idea being that the government would insure through a single payer system all catastrophic healthcare costs, so above a certain dollar amount. And then what everyone would do is they'd have, like right now, a lot of people have health savings accounts, HSAs. These are accounts you can use to pay your out-of-pocket cost to meet that deductible. And the government could essentially decide to fund those accounts either for everyone, or if you want to reduce the costs, only for low-income people. And so the advantage is that on the one hand, you don't have to worry about anyone not having insurance, or even having to pay too much, because even their out-of-pocket costs could be either fully covered by their HSA, or if you only subsidize low-income people, the vast majority of out-of-pocket costs. But on the other hand, you now have an incentive to shop around for all those small dollar expenses, which could create a lot of innovation. Getting Amazon and the Walmarts and all these other companies involved, not just in producing quality, which is really important, but also looking for ways, how do we deliver care cheaper? Because if you could deliver care cheaper, people would then choose that service and they'd be able to save money. Because the idea is you get to keep whatever's left over in your HSA. And so we can have a much more robust free market than we do now, while also getting all the main benefits of single payer.
Interesting. So this leverages innovation, which is something free market advocates tend to value. I mean, I think I myself, I advocate free market. I just oppose crony capitalism. I think we could have a good system of capitalism. And I think most people agree that leveraging innovation is a good idea. And you're saying this can leverage that kind of incentive in the right way, while also cutting costs and giving people more access.
Yeah, you're creating as much innovation and market competition as you can. The problem is with high dollar expenses is that practically nobody is shopping around with their own money for those costs anyway. And so all of those things are going to have to be covered by insurance. And to the extent that things have to be covered by insurance, there is an argument that a single payer is a better way to go. But for those things that don't need to be covered by insurance, that's where I think the robust market competition can really drive down costs and improve quality.
Interesting. There's a point that I think that where we started to see, this is I think about, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's more like 10 years ago. But we started to see like almost a Venn diagram convergence between the coffee party and what liberals call the coffee party, which is supposed to be a way to sit down and talk about what they share in common. And they started to agree, at least some leaders in those movements started to agree, that corporate special interest and disproportionate influence of our political system by billionaires was a problem that none of us benefited from. That really liberals, conservatives were all sort of getting shafted by the same fundamental revolving door. And it was almost a Venn diagram where they look at it from different ways. Liberals are angry at the corporations, conservatives are angry at the government, but it's this perverse marriage between corporate and government that takes away freedom of choice. And I think it was Ron Paul, and this is not to endorse Ron Paul. There's a lot of people that have many things for and against him. The point was he was talking about how, as a libertarian, he was talking about how very large pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, if you will, was creating barriers to entry through work in the political system. And they created these barriers to entry for smaller companies. So there's a barrier to innovation. And this created a kind of what they call elite capture in a lot of developing countries, third world countries. You have wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. This creates a kind of elite capture where political and economic power is sort of sealed off among the elites, stifles competition, innovation dies off, people become poorer, and you start to see something like a worse Gini coefficient, and you start to see more of a widening gap. That's bad for everybody. There's a good book by Darren Asimangu, and I forgot the co-author's name, called Why Nations Fail. And it showed these patterns, whether it's the Mayan Empire, why Venice collapsed, talks about on the Mexican border why one side has condos, the other side has slums. It's about the institutions. So that's one point about healthcare is as long as large pharmaceutical companies game the system and stifle real innovation. So I think this sort of almost creates segues into money and politics. I feel like healthcare is kind of intrinsically tied and shackled to the elite capture by special interest and billionaires. And that's not to demonize billionaires or anything like that. It's just to say the relationship between money and political power is something everybody across the spectrum, from Trump to Bernie supporters, see as a problem, but we can never get on the same page. We can never develop the same lexicon or the same sheet of music to come together about it, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point that I think about a lot myself, which is if there's something that unites, you know, whether you're a Bernie supporter or a Trump supporter or someone in the middle, is just the frustration with how dysfunctional our political system is. And I always like to think that there are the 5 big obstacles to just the democratic process that we have. And you mentioned the first one to me, which is our campaign finance system. And just real quick, I'll just mention them all. So that would, I think, is the first one. And try to imagine it like if you're going to run for office, the first thing you'd have to do is raise money, right? That's the first hurdle that you have. The second one is going to be the primary system, especially, the closed primary system. The third is gerrymandering. The fourth is our first past the post voting system. And the 5, and this sounds very narrow, but I think it actually has a huge impact, is the Senate filibuster. So in other words, if you're going to run for office, first you'd have to gain money. Second, you'd have to run probably in a closed primary, which is going to be dominated by the most extreme activists of the party that you're running in. If you emerge from that, and if you win the primary nomination, you have to hope that if you're running for Congress, that you are in a district that your party is competitive in and not gerrymandered against you. I'd also like to talk about the fact that we have kind of a pre-gerrymandered system when it comes to the Senate and to the Electoral College, and how those institutions, even if they weren't purposely created to give one party an advantage, effectively they do. And then if you decide that that you are in a competitive race and you run, you could lose because a third party candidate acts as a spoiler, even if a majority of people would have preferred you over your opponent. Or if you run as a third party candidate, you find that you really have no chance to win because of our voting system. And then if you do get elected to office and you get your bill, to pass one house, you end up in the Senate where it's very difficult to pass anything without a supermajority. And so there's just so many of these obstacles to implementing what people are looking for through our process.
Yeah, and then you got your Frank Underwoods running around blackmailing people and throwing people in front of subway trains. I mean, there's so many layers here, but no, this really reminds me of like Super Mario Brothers, where just to get to the princess, Toadstool always tells you the princess is in another castle, got to go down the pipe, and then there's just constant everything from people throwing those hammers at you, the Koopa Troopas to the Goombas, the turtles. And it's just like layers and layers of obstacles. And I really feel like this is almost like an evolutionary filter where only so many people get through. And the people that are best at that are most equipped at gaming the system are the best at, generally speaking, the best at becoming pathological liars and adopting a kind of sociopathic mindset. And I don't think most politicians are bad people. I tend to be somewhere between House of Cards and West Wing, where House of Cards depicts people as, sociopathic, Machiavellians. And West Wing, they're all like, you're very classy, honorable Martin Sheen doing the right thing for both parties, which is awesome. I love that. But I think most people are more like Veep, where they're not evil, but they're just really, there's a lot of incompetence and narcissism in the system. And, I don't think most politicians are malicious, but I don't think they're that noble. They're human. But yeah, it's like, you got to they tend to respond to really simple rewards and punishments. I feel like the only thing that seems to get them to respond is carrot or stick. Like, we're going to fund you or we're going to remove your funding. We're going to vote for you or vote you out, And so, how do you incentivize real reform within healthcare. It seems like education, it's common sense. You want to pay teachers a living wage and get the best teachers and pay them well. Like everyone agrees on that, I think, but we can't seem to fix that because there's no incentive to. Or like the stimulus. If Congress would be out on the street homeless, if they didn't pass the stimulus, that would get passed very quickly. I can almost guarantee you. In fact, I'm like 99% sure. If it was them and their families in danger, there would be a stimulus passed very quickly. So it's almost, it seems like a lack of true incentive, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. And the result is that, things don't get done. We end up with gridlock, and then each party and each side blames the other for why we're not making progress on all these different problems. The incentives, I really think are the heart of it. I think the problem is how the system incentivizes things. I mean, if you go back to campaign finance, who are the big donors, right? I mean, they're largely going to be two people who have a big incentive to want to donate money. One is people that have a vested interest in what the outcome is. They're going to have, again, more of an incentive to influence and to spend money, especially if you know it has a financial impact on you, the outcome of a particular election. And the other are activists who have very strong beliefs, who tend to be on the extremes. And so a lot of people think that the solution is, all the small money people donate are able to raise online, but that money tends to go towards the most provocative, confrontational candidates in both parties. And if you want to run in the middle, usually you have to rely on special interest money, which comes along with its own strings. And it's a really difficult problem. There is an idea out there that I think is interesting. It reminds me a lot of the previous idea on healthcare, where I think it combines a little of both sides. And that is this: you hear either democracy dollars or democracy vouchers, where you essentially can give people like a voucher that they could use to donate money to candidates. And so the idea here is, instead of trying to restrict contributions, which I don't think will work, because even if you just ban all contributions, which is not going to happen, big donors will find other ways of influencing elections. They'll run independent expenditures. You ban that, heck, they'll start their own media companies. And if you try to restrict that, then we have essentially no freedom of press. But what you can do is you can flood the money. You could flood the system with money from average people who normally wouldn't have enough of an incentive to reach into their pocketbook. But by giving them essentially this voucher, it kind of levels the playing field, I think, a lot more.
This is cool. It's like thinking outside the box. So like the money in politics will constantly adapt. It's like trying to fight the insurgents, where you could drop bombs all you want, but they're just going to spring up in different ways. But this is like a way to think outside the box, and instead of trying to directly stamp out money in politics, you find a way to equalize it through innovation. That's cool.
Yeah.
How does that work with average people? Is it like crowdfunding or?
Well, everyone would get, in fact, they've done this in Seattle, where people get a voucher, whatever it is, $50 or whatever, and you can donate that voucher to any candidate you want, or you could split it up, like $10 to 5 different candidates. Kristen Gillibrand, a senator from New York, has proposed this idea. It's not completely a fringe thing. And the other thing is, you don't have to worry about First Amendment issues when it comes to restricting campaign contributions. I know people who are in favor of reform or tend to be very opposed to the Citizens United decision. I will tell you, I actually supported that decision for the same reason the ACLU did. I do think it's a speech issue, because what you're essentially saying is, if you want to run, in that case, a documentary about a candidate that's making an argument, and that's considered a campaign contribution, that the government can limit that and how much you can spend. And that, I think, number one, do you think that has serious constitutional issues? And I don't think it's going to work. And John, just like you said, it's like you find insurgents, they'll find ways to get around it anyway.
This is interesting. One thing I think one of the most important things in politics is having the humility to change our minds when we're wrong. I mean, that's what drives science and innovation, and everything that works is adapting and learning when we're wrong. And I used to be just have this visceral reaction about Citizen United, like it's the root of all evil in our political system, like they're just guardians of this perverse revolving door. And then I took a step back, and the way I overcame this is I listened. Once again, I'm still a bit agnostic on that, but I would talk to people, like I'd surround myself with, whether it's drinking buddies or people on campus or in different podcasts or forums, and I'd listen to opposing views, and I'd be like, wait a minute, okay. And first thing I heard was that reasons why it doesn't work. And once again, I'm agnostic on this, but I tend to lean to what you're saying. It seems like it doesn't work. And if it could restrict free speech through a legitimate slippery slope, which could happen, that is a legitimate case for protecting free speech. I think that's really important. And if it doesn't even work, then we're focusing on the wrong target. So I need to think about it more, but I think getting people to open their minds about that and maybe redirect their energy a bit. Because I changed this is an example where I sort of changed my mind was when I genuinely listen to counter arguments, and I'm like, okay, maybe I'm really whacking at the wrong thing. And we need to think outside that box and focus on other ways to fight this problem. I know there's got to be a solution. Well, like in other countries, like, I don't know, Norway, Switzerland, whatever, are there ways to, like, why does America uniquely have this problem, or among developed nations, or is it not unique to America? But I'm sure there's countries that have a much better model where you don't have this perverse relationship between billionaire donors and political decision making. I mean, like, what are they doing right and we're doing wrong? Structurally, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, so a lot of countries, I mean, every country is a little different. I know in a lot of cases they have a proportional representation system where you essentially are voting for the party, not the candidate, and then they have party lists. And I would imagine in that situation, I don't know that money would be less important, but
Right.
it's not like you have to relearn about the candidates each time, right? Because there's X number of parties, and
Right.
and you can the other thing too is that, this is a little off topic, but I'm kind of just going where I'm kind of playing devil's advocate with a lot of reform people, because I know going back to the Senate filibuster for a moment. I know a lot of people like that idea because they think it forces compromise. But when you actually look at it, it just doesn't really have that effect very often. What it instead does is it becomes an excuse for parties, not an excuse, it's a reality of why parties can't enact their agenda, and then they just blame the other side. And there is an argument to be said is, if a party gets elected, let them enact their agenda and then let the voters hold them accountable to the results, right? So Trump gets in there, let's say he's got a Republican majority, let them do what they need to do, as long as they're not violating constitutional rights. And that's why, judicial review is important. And if people don't like the results, like if they actually repealed Obamacare, I think the Republican loss would have actually probably would have been much bigger in the elections, and hold the party accountable. And I think instead what happens is, people don't get their agenda passed, and then they almost use that as a way to raise money and go back to their donors and get everyone riled up at the other side, and we just never get anything done.
I think Eric's view of Citizens United is a little bit too charitable, because yes, it is a free speech issue, and I think this Roberts Court has a very, drastic, radical views on what free speech means in terms of, non-persons. But I think the negative impact of Citizens United is that it just floods this dark money, and not being able to have full disclosure of dark money. That's one thing. And then the second thing is, if you're just like an average Joe or Jane who would typically contribute, $20, $25 per campaign, now there's less incentive because you're competing with, upwards of millions of dollars. So why would you want to even have the vested interest to contribute to a campaign? So I think it works as a disincentive for those who would otherwise get involved during the campaign season.
Yeah, that's why I think the democracy dollars is a key part of that. I don't think the solution is to just a free for all where it's just dominated purely by big money. The idea is to try to counter big money with small money. In other words, you have enough people pooling their money, and they could do all these big donors. The problem is the average people just don't have that strong enough of an incentive. Even if something as small as a $20 or $50 donation, the result is, the fact is very few people make political donations. The people who are most motivated, again, tend to be the most extreme activists. But I do think that there is a legitimate, I mean, you'd have to wonder why the ACLU, came out the way it did on Citizens United. And there are just questions. If I, as a citizen, wanted to fund, I mean, in this case, it was a documentary, right? Something like that, or whatever it is, making a political argument, it's hard for me to see how restricting my ability to do that isn't like restricting speech, or at least, or at minimum, restricting someone's freedom to participate in the process of, battle of ideas.
Well, I'm pretty still agnostic on this, but I think it's good to hear these different sides. One area where I've seen more conservatives cultivate an appreciation for the ACLU, and I grew up, I think I told y'all I grew up down in Georgia in a much more conservative environment. And up until like my mid-20s, I was constantly exposed to the ACLU being vilified as like one of the worst organizations on earth. They're bringing, satanic debauchery and assaulting the American values. And now when I looked at it legally, I'm like, wait a minute, these people are actually consistently holding up free speech, whether we agree with every ruling or not. They are a consistent defender of free speech. And then after like 2013, when there's various various debates about free speech and the role of speech and things like that, a lot of conservatives, I think, started to appreciate what the ACLU does. That even if, defending unpopular opinions started to become very important under different types of pressure on campus and off campus. And I think a lot of conservatives and liberals started to converge on the merits of defending freedom of speech amidst controversy. Like one day my views are going to be suppressed and the next day your views will. It's really important to be consistent. So yeah, I did a big turn on that in my mid-20s about the ACLU. I was like, wait a minute, yeah, these people really are defending free speech. And I think with Citizens United, you really got to run it through that vetting, and maybe Thomas makes a good point. Like maybe are there ways to like adapt or modify it where we can preserve freedom of speech and those safeguards and have those guardrails while also confronting dark money? And, is there a way to sort of augment the ruling?
Well, I think that's the idea behind, behind democracy dollars of, instead of trying to limit, some people's ability to donate money, you're drastically increasing other people's participation in the process. That can actually counterweight the big money. The other thing too is that I also wonder, I don't want to put too much emphasis on it because as we just saw, in this past presidential election, if you look at how much money, for example, Mike Bloomberg spent, and the return on investment was not very good, both for himself and in Florida on behalf of Joe Biden. And that's just one example, but I've seen a lot of cases where better funded candidates still lose. So it's not always the case that the big money always wins on both sides. There were a couple of Democrats that were, I'm trying to remember who they were. In South Carolina, I want to say Harrison and I think Mike Espy in Mississippi, who raised significantly more than their Republican opponents. I mean, granted, these are red states, but still, lost pretty big. And so I think really what it's about is making sure that people can raise enough to get their voices out. Even if you're outspent, I think as long as people are exposed to your ideas, you have a good chance. So I think it's more about making sure that candidates can raise money that don't have connect. In other words, if you just limit the big money, you're not helping the little guy or the little gal who's trying to run for office and doesn't have connections to big money or isn't the favorite of the extreme activists. Like that person is still going to be at a disadvantage.
Right. It's really interesting. It's almost like, game theory when it talks about incentives, like if voters want to reward, if they want more of a certain type of behavior from politicians, they need to be more responsive to their incentives, reward more of what you want. And if people gravitate toward, the politician that has the loudest ads, that, uses like the Saul Goodman tactic of like loud ads on TV at 3 a.m, then if that's what you respond to because your limbic Darwinian brain goes off of emotion and you're not willing to use your prefrontal cortex and say, wait a minute, all right, let me take a step back and really think about this with the tools of critical thinking. And it is possible to critically think, like we are emotional creatures. We're hardwired evolutionarily to respond to emotion, but we can critically think, and people can be taught this, despite people saying the contrary. You can literally teach people to control for their political biases to an extent. And if people aren't willing to be more rational, they're going to continue to get played by the loudest used car ads at 3 in the morning. If we want more of this, then the people with the most money are going to continue to win. But I think we're overcoming this through some grassroots, social media, alternative platforms, and innovation within how we communicate. So, maybe there's hope in going in that direction too.
So you actually just reminded me of, I'm just going to throw a bunch of little ideas out here. Another idea I think that's interesting to reform the process, specifically when it comes to the House of Representatives, and that is just dramatically increasing its size. If I'm remembering correctly, I think we would be like well over 1,000 members if you limited each district to like 30,000 people, as it was in the past. So one of the arguments for this is that, number one, you wouldn't need as much money to run for Congress because your district would be a lot smaller. One of the things people say is that the candidates that people tend to know the best are the presidential candidates, and then they're very local candidates. And the in-between is often where money matters the most because people just often aren't as familiar with their Senate and gubernatorial candidates. And so this is a way of making the House of Representatives what it originally was, right? Much more of a grassroots and type endeavor, as you pointed out, John, where you wouldn't need as much money, to run for Congress. We would get it because it would be bigger. It would be a much more diverse group of people elected. Gerrymandering would be less of a problem simply because the districts would be so small that you just wouldn't get much of an advantage of trying to gerrymander anything. And I think that, could be a really interesting idea, especially if you look back at what the founders had said of just how they saw the House of Representatives is not at all what it is today.
Interesting.
So in other words, I think Erik's proposal is pack the House, right? You heard it here first.
Pack
the House, like you pack the courts.
Wait, none of these are my ideas. They're all ideas I've heard from other people that I've liked. I don't want to give myself credit for any.
Interesting.
Yeah, so at the conclusion of 2020, I just kind of looked at the world in a more kind of big picture viewpoint, and here we are talking about billions of dollars that were spent in the previous election. What do you think the future generations will think about our society? I mean, we have all this, just money being circulated. We're flush with cash in terms of campaign spending and negative ads. At the same time, we're talking about people waiting on food lines and not being able to pay for medical debt. I mean, it just seems like a very bizarre reality. And up until this year, I haven't really thought about it in that way, but I think the pandemic really kind of awoke me to this new perspective that, look, I mean, we gotta focus on certain things that are very visceral and existential to all of us. And I think as I sit here right now, listening to all this, dark money and super PACs and, negative ads being spent into $200 billion, just seems like our priorities are a bit misplaced, don't you think?
I think if there's something that future generations will look back upon us, it's probably climate change. Obviously, it's going to affect them more than us. It's going to be a much more lasting impact. And it's one, going back to John's point about incentives, where our political system there is a very little incentive to get anything done on climate because a lot of the benefits are postponed and the costs are upfront. And so that's a problem with any policy. The same thing is true. Look at the national debt. You look at entitlement reform. These are all areas where the government has been even more dysfunctional than normal in terms of getting anything done. And in fact, probably making things worse in those areas. And I do think part of it is fixing the system because a lot of the big money, opposes action on climate. But I'm almost kind of pessimistic because I think even if you had a perfectly functioning political system, I don't know how we get people to sacrifice for the common good, which is a larger issue. And John, you kind of alluded to this when you were talking about, with COVID and masks. I mean, and mask wearing and social distancing is such a small thing to ask of people. And for something that is people's lives are at stake. And I always think about people who serve in the military as you did, that's the ultimate sacrifice of putting your life on the line, for the common good. And just so few people are willing to do that, whether it's meaning, yes, to pay a little bit more in taxes, or, pay a little bit higher for energy so that we can literally save the planet. And that's something I think goes beyond even just the political system.
It's weird. I feel like if people feel, and you're spot on there, but I feel like if people feel that their efforts, like if they feel that paying a little more in taxes will genuinely go where it's supposed to and will really help their neighbors and their fellow Americans and their fellow humans, and they somehow see the impact, a lot more people, millions and millions more people would be willing to pay slightly more because there's a rate of return. And we have mirror neurons in our brain where we imagine what it's like to be the other person. We have this kind of empathy and we invoke moral imagination where we can imagine being someone else. And when you see your impact on some other human being, you're much more willing to give. And this is why certain websites like Donors, I haven't looked at this in years, but there's a website called Donors Choose where you can choose your cause, donate directly. And when the biggest thing about donor attention, if you look at research on nonprofits and philanthropy and giving, when they see the impact of their money, they want to give more. They want to continue to give because they really see where it's going. They see who they're helping. They do a video chat with a kid halfway across the world who's being helped in some fashion. So I feel like bridging that empathy gap is about showing people that it's working. And a lot of people are compassionate toward their friends, their neighbors. If you broke down your truck on the side of the road, this person would be the first one to give you a ride, or they'd help out a sick dog on the side of the road. But if you ask them to donate money to the government to help some abstract cause, they'll be like the first one to say, "Go F yourself. I don't want to help." It's not that they don't care. At least for some people, it's not that they don't care. They just want to. They want to know that what they're sacrificing for makes sense. And there's a lot of understandable skepticism with climate change protocols and global United Nations rulings and things like that. That's above most people's heads unless they do the research, myself included. It takes a lot of research to know what measures are really effective. So I think it's about going back to the basics, risk assessment. If there's even a 20% chance that anthropogenic or human-made climate change is real, and the predictions, the models, which are almost overwhelmingly, agreed upon by scientists. I mean, they may disagree on basics, but they may disagree on, specifics, but overwhelmingly there's a pretty good consensus. If there's even a 20% chance that these models are true, that is a catastrophic risk, like a Michael Bay movie level risk, Ronald Emmerich level risk, Independence Day, Armageddon risk, literally is, through second and third order effects, crop failures, iceberg flooding, of all kinds of disruptions of our ecosystem, which will precipitate human conflict. That is a catastrophic, humanity-changing risk. And yet these same people that, want to close off the borders because they're worried about Tuco Salamanca from Breaking Bad coming over the border, they want to, hedge against like every kind of risk imaginable when it comes to criminals and crime. But when it comes to catastrophic climate change, people completely disregard the risk. If there's even like a 5% chance, that's still a big risk. It's not just the probability, it's the severity of it being true. It's like if I blindfold myself and walk across the street, I might be a 5% chance a car's gonna hit me. That's still a big risk because if the car hits me, I'm dead. And so I think we need better models to like communicate with concern about risk management. If there's a 5% chance of a terrorist attack, we need to take countermeasures. And if we can reassure people that there are some countermeasures we can take to harden against catastrophic risk and secure the future of humanity, then let's find ways to do it that are reasonable. We're not trying to take away your freedom. We just want basic countermeasures. Can we agree on something? And if liberals need to learn to talk to conservatives, they need to adopt those tools. So any ideas there might literally save humanity, like I think,
Yeah, so this is a really good point. I mean, I pretty much agree with everything that you said. That really the challenge is having people see concrete benefits. And so one of the ways that I've changed on climate, I still think the ideal system would be, a carbon tax with revenue rebated to people. But I've come around to the idea that people need something more concrete than that in terms of seeing the effects. And so the idea, not specifically the Green New Deal in the way that it's often articulated, but something like that, where the government is just doing direct investment in energy jobs, whether it's clean energy and infrastructure, because it has two effects. Number one, that's something people can see, right? They can see the results, they can see. And then the other thing is you're building constituency now of people that work in these fields. So if you subsidize, electric cars, you have more people working in the electric car industry, or solar or nuclear even, in all these different areas. Now you just are building the constituency of voters that are going to support policies that help those industries. Because right now, the problem is you're promoting policies to help industries of the future that very few people are currently working for or benefiting from. And so it's very abstract.
Interesting.
Yeah, the other issue with climate change is that it's so transnational and transcontinental. So even if US and Canada, let's say, partnered up and pass all these initiatives, well, if the second and third greenhouse gas emissions nations are not doing their end, then it's going to be a moot point. So I think climate is such complex issue because of that. I mean, even if one nation really stood up and did their proportional, due diligence and responsibility, I don't think that's going to solve the problem because of the global scope and magnitude of it. So I think that's kind of the world that we live in. But if we look at it in a more, domestic side of things, again, just kind of alluding to that at the end of the year, we just look back at year 2020. And it seems like as we sit here in the middle of a pandemic, you would think that the number one concern in the public should be public health, should be, our overall well-being, ways that we could improve our healthcare system, the ways that we could improve our personal health. But it seems like we're not really putting that in the forefront, although that is a cognizable existential threat. What do you think?
Well, our system seems to be really fragile. I feel like the slightest pinprick and we're at the risk of, we're like right on the cliff, whether it's COVID or an economic, crisis or something. I think when it comes to people looking back on history, like our, kids and grandkids looking back maybe generation or 100 years, they're going to wonder why we had so much affluence and innovation and scientific knowledge and so much access to Star Trek for like half a century, and yet failed to have basic stability for average people. Literally average Americans are not living in a stable situation economically or with their health. And your health is really all you have at the end of the day. So I think more appreciation for the importance of stability, logical safety nets that work, and why economic and health mobility is so important for everybody, and that liberals and conservatives should finally build a consensus on the need for a better system of stability for the average person. And this is integral to a virtuous cycle of economics where, more wealth creates more opportunity, which generates business and employment. These things, this is a cycle. And when the system works for everybody and provides basic stability, there's more demand. It's a cycle that tends to lift all boats. It's a virtuous upward spiral instead of a vicious downward spiral. And I think that's a sobering moment from 2020 has been a real moment of sobriety where we have to step back and say, we have a problem. We need to rehabilitate aspects of our system and really reflect on this because something's fundamentally broken here,
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's always interesting to see what other prominent thinkers have to say about healthcare. So I think we have a video queued up here. I think this one is a snippet from Jordan Peterson, and this is his take on certain healthcare policy prescriptions. So let's cue up the video.
It seems indisputable, I would say, that the Canadian healthcare system is preferable to the American healthcare system, except at the very highest end. And there's a couple of reasons for that that would even perhaps appeal to conservatives. One is the amount of administrative overhead that's spent by Canadian health institutions is far less in Canada than it is in the US. Partly because hospitals don't have to collect money. So they don't spend 30% of their intake on the financial end of the equation, which is approximately the case in the US. And everyone has access to healthcare in Canada. And because of that, our rate of individual entrepreneurship is higher in Canada than it is in the US. And that's because people don't have to worry about losing their healthcare if they switch jobs. They can switch jobs more easily, and they can also take risks if they have a family. They can take entrepreneurial risks without putting all the health of their entire family at stake. So these things can't be broken down really simply into right-wing versus left-wing issues, right? They're too complicated. But the overall point is that Canada has done a very good job of having that conversation. Even our socialists are basically fiscally conservative, right? Although they're not socially conservative. But there are signs of the kind of polarization in Canada that's really plaguing the United States. And of course, that's not good for the US. It's not good for Europe, where it's also happening, but it's also not good for our country. And I don't want that to happen.
Wow. I love it. That's awesome.
So what do you think about this notion? Because one thing that he brings up is that through life, there's all kinds of risks, whether if it's business risk, health risk, risks that you have to confront for your family. So what he's saying essentially is that if you take out the health risk out of the equation, then you can focus on other risks like, entrepreneurial risk, etc. So I think that assumes that in life, there are certain risks, and it's just all about kind of allocating and setting certain priorities on which risks we're willing to kind of take on. Do you agree with that premise?
Yeah, I agree with that premise. I definitely think those are two huge advantages of single payer, the reduction in administrative costs, and then the ability, Thomas, as you were talking about, for people to take that, entrepreneurial risks, knowing they don't have to worry about like losing their health insurance, if they leave their job. And which again is why I do support it. I think we could add more innovation again by limiting it to catastrophic expenses. But once you get into that arena where you have to have insurance to pay for these things, I just think single payer makes a lot more sense than having a hodgepodge of different private insurance companies that are have to spend money on marketing and duplicative administrative costs, and they're trying to figure out how to get a healthier clientele and avoid the risky ones, and that just creates a lot of inefficiencies.
Yeah, well, we look at like what Americans, what do we really value, and what do we talk about being things that we say are most important to us: freedom of choice, freedom to better yourself, freedom to really realize your potential and take risk and be an entrepreneur, or at least just better really develop yourself as a human being. That breathing space requires a basic level of financial and stability in your financial life and in your health, your ability to stay healthy and not worry about catastrophic risk to your life. And so this is one of those areas of just enormous common ground, the kind of shared moral terrain between conservatives and liberals in America that most don't even realize exist. It's almost like we're artificially divided with this smokescreen in an area where we should be sharing a beer and fighting for the same thing. We want stability in our lives and the breathing space to be better, just to better ourselves and to pursue our inner passions. That's the whole idea of economic freedom and liberty, is the freedom to pursue what makes us, whole, what drives us to tap into those passions and pursue, a journey of self-betterment, follow our abilities and dreams. And what Jordan Peterson was talking about should, what many people have talked about, I've had countless conversations with people across the political map. They all agree on this. A system that works for people and that really gives us basic stability is better for everybody, economically, spiritually, emotionally, and it's a better measure of freedom and happiness. And if we're not, what are we fighting for when people talk about freedom? Like, there's many different types of freedom, but like, why do so many people cling to a healthcare system that is clearly not cost effective and not working for average people? To me, it makes no sense. And I think most people are at a point where they agree. Like, we really should come together and demand something better. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to see some conservatives now kind of adopt some of those policies too. Like, I know, for instance, senators like Ben Sass and of Nebraska, Josh Hawley of Missouri. I think they're a bit more kind of populist. I guess Lindsey Graham is also in that boat too. And I think once upon a time, Obamacare was just vilified as government takeover of healthcare. But now I think conservatives, or those who are right of center, are starting to embrace certain components of Obamacare, like the pre-existing condition. I mean, that's overwhelmingly popular, as well as certain expansions of Medicaid. So I think it's all about kind of repackaging and selling to the public, like, look, this is actually good for you in certain ways because it'll give you better access to certain quality healthcare.
Well, it's weird. If you reframe it as a conservative idea, people are far more likely to buy into it if they're conservative. It's a very big test of human bias. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of Mitt Romney's plan had a lot of overlap with Obama's plan. And like Obamacare, what Mitt Romney proposed before he ran for president was similar to what Obama proposed. And if you reframe it in conservative language, in a kind of through a conservative moral lens, then people's tribalism is reduced and they're less resistant to the message. And to me, that's really sad, because it means it's less about the merits of the message and more about who's saying it. It's we've talked about this, Thomas. If you take Thomas Sowell, who conservatives, rightly admire as an amazing, like a very well-established intellectual with dozens of books. If you take one of his quotes about critical thinking or education or propaganda, and you reframe it as something Chomsky said, a lot of Thomas Sowell's fans would reject it. And vice versa for the left. If you take something Thomas Sowell said, attribute it to Chomsky, more liberals will listen to it because they care more about the messenger than the message. And that's the problem with this, is that people care. You have to reframe things so people think it's their tribe's idea. And that tribalism is so fundamentally deceptive. It's a way that keeps us artificially divided through labels, where something's either liberal, conservative, populist, socialist. People should start to evaluate ideas based on the merits. And it's one argument for legalizing marijuana. More weed smoking and more Carl Sagan and more looking at microscopes and learning about science and less attachment to partisan ideology will free up so many adult minds. Like in high school, you want to get kids off drugs. I think we need a campaign to get adults off ideological thinking. I think ideological thinking has done more damage to people's brains than all the weed smoked in high schools combined. So, not to get all Joe Rogan on you, but I really think ideological thinking and tribalism is such a barrier to our own ability to flourish and find ways to coexist and improve our own lives. And most people just need to get out of their own way and say, let's evaluate it on their merit,
Yeah, and John, again, I couldn't agree with you more. First of all, on Obamacare, yeah, it was Romneycare. And in fact, when he ran for president the first time in 2008, he wanted to use it as a model for the country. So even in his campaign, Romney was pushing it. But before that, the whole idea really came up from the Conservative Heritage Foundation. It was adopted by Newt Gingrich as a counter to the Clinton healthcare plan in the 90s. So it really was a Republican idea. Yeah. And was supported by Republicans before it became labeled Obamacare and became labeled by Democrats. And what's worse now is, they've done these studies, which are really sad, to your point, where they take a group of Democrats and Republicans and they take Democrat talking points and Republican talking points and switch them. So they tell the Democrats that these Republican ideas are Democrat ideas and vice versa. And everyone loves their own party, even when the ideas are switched around.
Oh my God.
Yeah, this has happened again and again. And so how do you break that partisan thinking of, I'm going to support my party right or wrong, which I think is a lot of what is leading to this voter fraud, uh, allegation and
It
conspiracy
is.
idea. Yeah.
We got to fight the echo chambers and get people talking to each other and really starting to, at least like the heart, the emotions are really the gateway to the brain. So you can't, it's hard to like attack people. It's hard to like directly, throw facts at people or attack their beliefs. It's better to build an emotional bond and try to get them to be willing to listen. I think people talking to each other, building empathy, building sort of the willingness to humanize each other and listen over a beer, over a podcast, over a video during COVID, or just getting people out of the echo chamber. It's like that movie, The Island, the Michael Bay movie 10 years ago or so with Ian McGregor and Scarlett Johansson, where they're like, they're like trapped in this artificial reality where they're basically killing them to harvest their organs, but they create this illusory world, this illusionary world around them. And then Ian McGregor eventually discovers it's all a facade and escapes the facility and sees the real world and leads the rest of the people outside the gates. That's what echo chambers are. They keep people imprisoned in this artificial, sort of a psychological bubble, epistemological bubble. And it really limits their exposure to other ideas, and it creates an emotional barrier to listening and being open to the world around them. And it's really suffocating. I think there's mental health issues too with echo chambers. And so, I really think it's about building more connectivity between people and talking to each other and getting Americans to talk to Americans. Most Americans are not on the fringe. Most Americans are not radical socialist leftist, nor the Trump LARPer, freaking orange freaking insurgents that storm the Capitol. Like, most people are not on these extremes. And social media has this illusory power to make us think that everyone else is on the other fringe. And it creates an artificial sort of polarization. And that's what my book's about, by the way. It's about psychological warfare based on my experience in the Army, but it's also about how we can create these exchange spaces on campus, through digital mediums, through social media, through the pub. The pub is called a public house. Pubs used to be places where people went to talk about politics and drink a pint together, in the early evening and exchange ideas. And I think reviving pub culture, with or without the beer, is a great way to really, kickstart a better paradigm for national discourse. And I think most people are fundamentally disillusioned with the current state of our discourse. Most people realize Twitter and Facebook debate is fundamentally toxic. It doesn't represent real life. Like today, I talked to someone on Twitter. He just kept coming at me. This guy hated me. He was like, "You never served in the military. You're terrible, blah, blah." And I just like, you know what? I'm going to kill him with civility. I'm just going to be like, "All right, why are you angry? Do you really believe if we were talking together in a pub, would you really be talking to me this way?" And he's like, "Well, maybe not." I'm like, Twitter doesn't reflect real life. Direct message me. Let's have a conversation. And then later he's like, "Hey, we're cool. Let's talk later." I'm like, "All right, man, cheers." And now we're friends. So like that's what we need on a national scale. It's a paradigm shift.
Well, yeah, I think part of the problem is really this two-party system, right? That creates this divide where you're, team A or team B, and it's just,
Right.
it fuels this, the polarization. And so the question is the answer to move away from parties, or is the answer to have more parties instead of just having, two? And how do we change the system? It goes back to what you said originally or earlier about incentives, either way.
I struggled. This is one of my biggest passions, like about a decade ago, was about, I've always hated the two-party system and always thought it really created this false binary, this black and white thinking, this, for it or against it, all or nothing. You could predict people's views across like a dozen unrelated issues, from foreign policy to economics to nuclear proliferation to climate change and gun control and crime and everything. They all seem to line up neatly across a predictable set of issues. And this does not reflect in, critical thinking or independent thinking. And so I've always had a really deep resentment of our sort of, me versus you tribalism within our two-party system. I don't know what I really honestly, I'm a poli-sci, I have a poli-sci degree. I'm, very open to looking at different ideas and data sets. But I've come to a point where I'm more like a little bit of a blank slate here, and I'm kind of humbly seeking ideas. I mean, I have less to offer here in the way of answers and more in the way of asking the right questions. I mean, like, what do we do to fix the two-party system? I don't know. Is it a parliamentary style system? Is it empowering third parties? Because that's going to require a bunch of other changes in how money and media works. I mean, I don't know. I've been humbled by the last couple of years. I mean.
Well, why don't we check out the next video and we'll comment on it after we take a look at it. This one talks about different political parties. So let's see, Annat, when you get a chance, let's cue that one out.
If you don't like Congress, and Congress is fundamentally an ongoing fight between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, isn't the thing that would fix it a third party? I think I get that question more than any other. The thing there is that it really comes down to what you mean by the word fix. Do you remember the underpants gnomes from South Park?
I don't get it. You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit. Oh, I get it. No, you don't, fat ass.
It gets a bit like that. You have step 1, a third party. Step 2, step 3, politics is fixed, hooray. Let's talk for a second about step 2, those question marks. The problem third parties can solve is a problem of idea suppression. For some reason, there's a popular idea or a popular grouping of ideas, and neither party's won back. Third parties can break the monopoly Democrats and Republicans have over which ideas get considered. The problem they can't solve, the problem they might actually make worse, is a problem of no ideas, not even the ideas backed by Democrats and Republicans being able to make it through the hellscape of fail that is the US Congress. In fact, a third party might make that hellscape of fail even worse. One of the people I spoke to about third parties when trying to figure this out is Ronald Rappaport. He's a political scientist at Williams and Mary, and he wrote the book on third parties. I mean that totally literally. The book is called Three's a Crowd. The thing he says is third parties to survive need a, quote, unique agenda. If someone is going to actually go to the trouble of supporting a third party, they need a damn good reason. And that reason is usually that the third party is saying something that those people really believe, that the big two parties are not saying. It's worth stopping on that point for a moment because Washington forgets it completely. The constant talking about a third party is a third party by elites and for elites. The third party of Unity 08, Michael Bloomberg running for president, Simpson Bowles, of technocrats, of the Brookings Institute, sober moderate, things people in Washington already care about. That is not how successful third parties look. They're about the things that Washington elites don't care about, or at least don't care about in the correct combination. Ross Perot's supporters, for instance, they were completely pro-choice, totally anti-affirmative action, and really nationalist, which is to say they weren't moderates. Third parties are not moderate. They were extreme in ways that went left to right, and then back to right, and then back to left, again and again and again. So if that's your problem, that no one in Washington talks about what you care about, then a third party is a weapon that can help. Again, think about Perot. Bill Clinton was much more focused on reducing the deficit because Perot showed the issue's total power. Newt Gingrich's contract with America was a very close echo of Perot's United We Stand. By 1996, there wasn't that much left for Perot and his party to do. But ideas are not Washington's problem right now. The problem is that no ideas are moving at all. The basic machinery of government, the thing that is supposed to take ideas and make them, if they're popular and sound, into laws, has stopped functioning. A third party might actually make that worse. Let's start with the likeliest third party win, a third party president. Some super charismatic, probably super rich figure comes in and wins the presidential election. Right now, the basic problem in American politics is that one of the two major political parties has an interest in destroying the president at any given time. The new Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said in 2010, quote, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." With a third-party president, both parties would have an interest in destroying the president, not just one. In fact, the party the president was actually closer to on policy might be even more committed to her destruction, because a third party is a bigger threat to the party it agrees with most. Think of Ralph Nader being a spoiler for Al Gore. So that would be the problem for a third party president. They would get even less congressional cooperation than a Democrat or Republican. But it's also possible for a third party to win a bunch of seats in the House and Senate and try to fix Congress from the inside. That's also damn hard. Everything in Congress, pretty much, is structured by the two major parties. Committee assignments, debate rules, floor time, all of it. A third party that didn't play ball would find itself powerless. That's why third party candidates who do win in congressional seats tend to work with one of the two parties. Think of Bernie Sanders from Vermont or Angus King from Maine. They won their seats as third party candidates, but they caucus with and act like traditional Democrats. In Congress, even when you have 3 or more parties, you quickly realize you only really have 2. But the other problem is that even if a third party did win seats in Congress and accepted less institutional power, it's hard to see what problem it would actually solve. Congress is split by disagreements it can't resolve and an inability to compromise. A third party would simply add more disagreements and more people who needed to be compromised with into the mix. Which is to say that all the crazy incentives and screwed up structures that are causing so many problems in our two-party system would end up causing just as many problems, if not more, for third parties. A third party might change the ideas Washington takes seriously, but it's hard to see it fixing the fact that Washington can't do anything with the ideas it already does take seriously.
So, Erik, is that the issue that we have in our society, is lack of influence of third parties?
I actually largely agree with that video in a large kind of big picture scope of it. That just the way everything is structured right now, not only is it really hard for third party candidates to win, but it would be hard for them to be effective, even if they did. I think what's interesting is I live in New York. We have a little bit of a different model where a third party in New York not only can run its own candidates, but there's something called fusion voting where they can endorse a Democrat or Republican. And I think in that situation is a little different because then a third party can put pressure on the major parties to adopt certain positions by offering the ballot line or being an organized swing vote in a Senate. So for example, you have a close race between a Democrat or Republican and a third party, like for example, the one I'm affiliated with, SAM, the Serve America movement. And we could simply say, and our whole thing is political reform, a lot of the topics we've talked about. So if one of those two candidates is willing to support the kinds of reforms that we like, we can endorse that candidate and put them on our ballot. And even if we got 1% of the vote, that 1% could make the difference in a close election. So I think when you can act that way, a third party can make a big difference. But in terms of just like electing your own people, number one, it's going to be very hard to do unless we change the voting system, which we can talk about. But even if you do get into office, it is going to be hard, I think, to get things done.
Yeah, but we just talked about Citizens United before about how there's some flooding of billions of dollars into campaign coffers. So if you're an independent third-party candidate looking to then make a name for yourself, I mean, it's really nearly impossible to, the barriers of entry are so high that you cannot even make a presence.
So the barriers to entry are high, but I actually don't. And actually, by the way, in New York, unfortunately, they've just gone much higher to get ballot status for third-party independent candidates. But I don't actually think that that's the root of the problem, because if you can't get on the ballot and if you can't enter, you probably don't have enough support to win anyway. I think the bigger issue is just we have what they call the first past the post voting system, where whoever gets the most votes, it sounds simple, right, wins. And the problem with that is it makes it really hard for third-party candidates because people don't want to waste their vote and they focus just on whoever is in the top two. Because if you vote for your first choice and they don't make it, then your second choice might lose to the candidate you hate the most. And the example that's perfect is the one they cite in that video of Ralph Nader arguably costing Al Gore the election, when probably most Nader voters would have preferred Al Gore to George W. Bush. And so some of the ideas that have been talked about there is ranked choice voting, which has now been implemented in New York City for primaries and special elections, where people can rank their candidates. If nobody wins a majority, the bottom candidate gets dropped, and those votes go to their people's second choice until someone gets a majority. So you can vote for your first choice, which might be a third-party candidate. If they don't make it, your vote can then go to your next choice. There are other things like John mentioned, proportional representation. So if your party gets 25% of the vote, you get 25% of the seats. There's also something called approval voting, where you just vote for all the candidates you like, and whoever gets the most votes wins. But the idea is you can vote for multiple candidates. You can vote for your first choice and your second choice. So a Nader voter could have voted for Nader and voted for Gore. And that is particularly helpful to candidates that are in the middle, who may not be anyone's first choice, but may be everyone's second choice, and they could emerge as kind of a consensus pick.
Wow. I'll be honest, that it really, the thing is, like, you bring up a lot of really important points, but these are details that they're fundamental to how our political system works and functions, but they're not things that are glamorized easily in a 30-second soundbite or clip or ad. And these are the details that a lot of Americans don't want to have to focus on or don't think about, but they're still central to the problem, at least to some degree. And I feel like that's the technocratic dilemma, is that a lot of these issues are intrinsically tied to procedural and technical details that poli-sci nerds like me, and I think all of us like, or at least understand and think about. Most people don't. And that's a dilemma. I mean, if someone could create like the perfect TV show that would actually really highlight these issues and break them down and do everything you talked about in something compatible with like a Netflix TV series, that might bridge some understanding. But in the meantime, it's really hard for people to hone in on those technical details. That's something I've always struggled with, is how do you redirect people's attention to the play devil's advocate to why some of this stuff doesn't always work. Like I used to be extremely passionate about, like about 8 years ago, I started writing a book, and my writing style was just terrible. It was like very emotion driven, but I was very passionate. And I was talking about the idea of like, uniting the clans like in Braveheart, and like, how can we start a third party that can map out common shared values and call out all the problems on both sides and try to break up the monopoly of the two-party system. Then I hit the sobering wall of why there's so many barriers to that happening, and why, like in the video that Ezra Klein had, honestly, I've never seen that before. I was familiar with some of that, but he just showed a kind of game theoretic set of reasons for why some of this stuff is not going to work, and why it actually could be counterproductive. And that, just watching that video completely reoriented my thinking. I'm like, wow, like literally just now I had new epiphanies. Like that is not something I thought about. It's counterintuitive. So you're right. This is actually kind of humbling. Like watching that video was a bit sobering for me.
Yeah. So, John, I mean, you bring up a good point when you're talking about the marketing, right? With the 30-second commercial, that you can't really convey a lot of this stuff. I think the way you'd have to do it is, so if you were running a 30-second commercial, or you're making sound bites on TV, you couldn't go into all this detail, but you could, like if you were running for office, I mean, in many ways, think about Donald Trump, right? And a lot of his campaign was, drain the swamp. No one really knew the details of what that meant. I don't know if there were any details, but he had that image, right? He had that brand. Same thing he did on immigration, on all these topics. And just sometimes he had a little bit more detail, most of the time he didn't. So you could run a campaign that looked like that, but also have on your website all the detail. So for those people who are interested in, I want to know what that means, I can go on the website, I can immerse myself. But for the majority of the people, as you point out, who are not going to do that, if they know you as the reform candidate, as the brand, that's your brand, I think it's still very effective.
So it could be like Donald Trump's campaign seemed like one really loud, really effective used car ad at 2 a.m, and yet in some ways it is effective at getting people's attention and capturing, their emotions. But then how do we then get people use the same psychology, the same basic techniques, which going back as a PSYOP veteran, goes psychological operations, developed out of advertising and propaganda in World War II. There's been decades of research since, but long story short, there's ways to entice the brain and ways to get people's attention. And you could tap into that playbook. It's not good or bad. It's like the Force in Star Wars. It's not good or evil. It depends on how it's used. So if we could use the Force for good and you have a very emotionally effective campaign that entices people and is flashy and gets people's attention, but then redirects people to look at the website, go to this YouTube clip, do the research, and really build that bridge between flashy emotion and exploring something for themselves. Because average people are not dumb. That's actually a myth. You can take people that live, whether they live in a trailer park, you work in a car shop, they're not dumb. If you give them something they're interested in, they'll learn how to do it. You take someone who's like admittedly dumb as hell on whatever topic, people are like, hey, I'm really dumb on this, but they're really good at what they do. They're good at, construction or carpentry or fixing a car or Minecraft or chess or whatever. If people like something, they can become good at it. People are not too dumb to this. You just got to emotionally entice them, lead them down that pipeline of learning about something. Like some of the dumbest people are really smart in certain areas. They're just in an echo chamber, It's like your smart idiot effect. So, and I think most Americans are not, or neither, most Americans are not extremists and most Americans are not dumb. And even most quote unquote dumb people are not actually dumb. It's just the different types of, different aptitudes. And I think average Americans have every ability to learn about this if they're interested. If people can watch House of Cards or Game of Thrones and understand the plot, they can learn about third parties. It's just how do you direct them there emotionally? If some billionaire were to fund the proper incentive and say, we're going to give $1 billion to whoever creates, a Netflix style YouTube series on this, that would probably produce a lot of effective content. So, I mean, what if a billionaire was like, a socially concerned billionaire said, I'm going to fund, a sort of social innovation project to see who has top 3, top 5 best ways to get people interested in civic literacy, critical thinking, and constitution. Within 6 months to a year, we would probably have enormous progress in civic literacy, I think, doesn't have to be an Arby's commercial with someone laying on the, Paris Hilton laying on the trunk of a car. It could be a number of ways, but,
Yeah.
Well, don't you think the way how issues are framed these days, everything is left versus the right. So I just don't know what role a third party would play, because just by default, they would be kind of caught in between somewhere. And on certain issues, they have to tag along with one side. And then on other issues, they have to tag along with the other side. So I think the idea of a third party might be refreshing, especially to those who are disenfranchised and no longer engaged actively. I think in reality, given our existing, two-party system, if you really want to have an independent party, there would have to be 5 parties, I think. And here's, I think, my kind of breakdown of how these parties would play out. Is that right now you have 2 major parties, and then you have a faction within each party. So you have the Freedom Caucus within the GOP, which is kind of like the continuation of the Tea Party. And they're the ones that brand themselves as, well, we are the pure conservative, not the establishment. And then on the liberal side, you have the Squad and Justice Democrats who say, we are the true progressive, not these, Chuck Schumer types who kowtow to corporate interests. So I think the 2 parties will have their subset proclaiming to be the purists. So then you have 4 parties right there. And then you're going to have another party come in and say, no, this is not the way how we frame the issues. It's not left versus right. There's another way to offer some kind of solutions. And I think that party will be the 5th party that could be more instrumental. What do you think?
Makes sense to me. Yeah, it's like game theory. It's like you have two parties on each side committing for purism versus orthodoxy and purism, or whatever, establishment and purism. And then you have that fifth is kind of the creative destruction that really sort of disrupts the narrative and says, all right, we're going to try, we're forced by our this Darwinian playing field to be creative enough to deliver messages and find the best on both sides and fuse it. It's almost like Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, or a kind of fusion of like a fusion center for like taking what works, adopting what makes sense, and discarding what is toxic and saying, here's the best idea. So I feel like it's a self-organizing, emergent kind of, system that pressures the best narrative to sort of discard the toxic stuff and retain the good stuff. I mean, that's just my take. I may be off here, but it seems like that might happen.
So I agree with your breakdown, Thomas, but probably for a different reason. And that is, it's not that I see the two extremes as just pure. I think they actually have a lot in common, where if they were their own party, they could actually ally on some issues. For example, you take trade, right? If you think, I'll use Bernie Sanders as an example of on one end and Donald Trump on the other, versus the more centrist or establishment Democrats and Republicans. Foreign policy is another, right? How interventionist should we be? So there are these issues where there could be these new interesting alliances. The same thing if one of the parties was a libertarian party who might take left-wing positions on certain social issues and foreign policy, but very right-wing positions, but also be very pro-free trade, right? On a lot of these economic issues. So I think it works to the extent that these parties are not, if it's just a line, then it doesn't, like it actually a two-party system makes sense if it was just everything was on one spectrum. But where I think it becomes, where it opens an opportunity is when you have, kind of like what the video is saying, when you have a party that is a mix of liberal and conservative, where you can create these new alliances on particular issues. But I think before we can get to any of that, there has to be a change in the voting system. I don't think a third party can emerge with our current first past the post voting system.
Well, if you look at any viable or successful third-party candidates in the last 25 years, I mean, they tend to be more of like a technocrat type. Again, Ross Perot was certainly, he was very wealthy. He was, a billionaire, self-funded, so he was able to keep that campaign going. I don't think a regular Joe Plumber could, be self-funding and run a very successful and effective campaign. Mike Bloomberg, sure, he wasn't successful, but at least he was able to make impressions and be influential when he was running for public office. I think Andrew Yang might be in that category too. I know he's, fairly wealthy from his business ventures. So,
I would love that.
I think we might be having different definitions of technocrat because I guess I don't see, and I think this is actually highlighted in the video, that most successful third parties are not kind of technocrat centrist type. They're more populist, actually. I think of, when I say successful, it's all relative. Perot somewhat was a technocrat, but he ran primarily as a populist. So did Nader. Buchanan ran on the Reform Party in 2000. Gary Johnson to an extent. They weren't like kind of the Simpsons Bowles. That's what I think of a technocrat. Bloomberg to an extent, but Bloomberg was elected, remember, as a Republican first. Andrew Yang is kind of like Perot in the sense that he's a weird mix, but I still see him as more of a populist. He's not like an insider. I guess when I think of a technocrat, like I said, I think of the Simpsons Bowl approach of like, let's get together these experts, and form together this centrist compromise. And unfortunately, there just isn't that much popular support for that type of approach.
Yeah, so speaking of populism, do you think this current wave of populism that we're experiencing right now, is that something that's just a trend, or do you think this is here to stay for a while? Because there's certainly a certain brand of left-wing populism and right-wing populism. So what do you think the future of this kind of populist resentment is going to be?
So I read an article talking about, or just looking historically, that these types, so this is a global phenomenon, right? It's not limited to the United States, but that both in the past and even in other countries right now, they haven't lasted that long. And in fact, even with the defeat of Trump, that might be the end of this kind of Trumpian populism in America, that these things tend to to emerge and then dissipate. And the real reason is that they get elected, making all these promises, and then they just can't actually deliver. And when people realize that, they kind of lose favor.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to see it being sustainable.
That's interesting. All I know is I do miss the Andrew Yang debate parties that I used to go to in New York City. Those were quite fun. That was basically, this is during the Democratic debates, and we would just go to the bar, go to the pub, and just watch all the people debate. And then people would like come out, with Yang Gang T-shirts and watch the debate. And I feel like that kind of brings people together on that human level, because where we tend to be tribal, we organize around like high school football rallies or whatever it is, television watch parties, Super Bowl. That's a very common way to bring people together. And, we got to find ways to keep, to sort of merge the technocratic side of this with the human side of this and engage people effectively, and then get them talking to each other. And maybe you don't have to directly communicate all the nuances, get them interested, and then they'll talk to each other about all the nerdy details. Because you get people interested in politics, then they talk to each other, and then, at a house party or in the bar or over Facebook, and they'll share like leaks and data all day long and just talk about the gritty details. So maybe reinvigorating conversation could be in part based on looking at what are the best ways people come together socially. And once COVID dies down, there's going to be, I think, a big springboard effect of people having a newfound appreciation for social connectedness. And people are going to really be flooding public spaces and really appreciating human contact, more than they used to. And that might create a good vacuum for, getting people to engage in political ideas, because people realize we need better answers. But yeah, it's just some thoughts there.
Yeah, so before we wrap this up, we have 2 weeks left of the Trump administration, and then we're getting ready for a new administration to come in. Any lasting impressions of Trump's legacy?
Oh God, I'm gonna sit this one out. I wouldn't even know how to muster up the headspace to properly articulate this one. So I'm gonna kind of lay low here.
Well, let me ask you this question, since we're talking about third parties and like disruptors. I mean, again, take away, a certain, I guess, bombastic aspect of the presidency. He was a disruptor in a sense that he ran as an outsider. He brought up these kind of unorthodox issues to make it very attractive to conservatives. So in that sense, I think he was certainly a game changer, don't you think?
Undeniably it is, for better or worse. It was definitely disruptive. I think it forced us to think about how to better reach the wider population. It reminded me of like the effect of like vacuums of legitimacy in Iraq or Baghdad, where the population was rightly disillusioned and angry, and then people would fill that vacuum with different types of narratives, like the Muqtada al-Sadr, Mahdi militia, or the Badr Brigade, Iranian-sponsored Badr Brigade. These radicals would come in with populist narratives and easily capture the hearts and minds of people that were angry, desperate, poor, who rightly saw the government as corrupt, and they were rightly pissed off. But then that vacuum of legitimacy gets filled by a kind of radicalizing narrative. And that was exactly what the Trump campaign reminded me of in so many ways. I'm like, this is, psychological warfare 101. And we need to fix certain conditions so that we don't have these massive amounts of disillusionment among the wider population. Their hearts and minds are not as easily captured by extremist narratives. That's my take on that. So it did expose a wider problem in many ways.
Obviously it was a huge disruptor. I was really hoping for a big repudiation of Trumpism at the polls, which obviously didn't happen. And so, unfortunately, I think we're just going to have to continue slugging it out between the parties. And, you know, what I would like to see is a decisive, and maybe after what happened with the storming of the Capitol, that could be, you know, the straw that breaks the camel's back and you know, could really lead to a repudiation of the Republican Party next year.
Okay.
I'll close on a final thought. I think there should be like a healthy kind of schism, maybe a nonviolent civil war within the Republican Party, where they're forced to separate, you know, toxic ideas and extremism from more sensible ways to be a conservative, and really create that kind of creative destruction and split the party in two, and then maybe reinvent itself or create two different factions. That's a theory I have, maybe another discussion for another time, but I think there has to be a fundamental split in the Republican Party. Because I think there's two different completely incompatible ideas of what it means to be a conservative, and they can no longer coexist. This has reached a critical mass where they've got to split off and redefine what it means to be an American, to be a conservative, and, you know, reject some of the more extremist and toxic, you know, ideas. So that's my theory there. Who knows?
Okay, yeah, that's something we're gonna have to explore some other time. Looks like we're running out of time because I know, Erik, you gotta go, so I do appreciate you joining us. And John, Annat, thanks again. This was our debut episode. We hope to do it again in the future. There's gonna be other guests that we'll be having on. The purpose of this, these podcast episodes is that we have so many thinkers and philosophers and other quasi-public intellectuals in the greater New York City area. So we're hoping that by having these podcasts, we could sit down and just, you know, have a very in-depth conversations on a whole host of things, politics, culture, and whatever else is on people's minds. So thanks once again, guys. Be well, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for having me.